Hi and welcome to another video in our Game of Thrones Vivarium series. In today's video we're going to be covering how we made the ruins of the Red Keep. To start with, we downloaded this amazing 3D model of some ruins made by Brimstone326 on Thingiverse.com and split it into multiple pieces so that we could print a large one to go in our setup. We then printed out each of the pieces in PLA at 0.3mm layer height and used some 5-minute epoxy to stick the different pieces together. Once the whole model was put together, it was time for some of the finishing work. Now we could have sanded and filled this model to make it nice and smooth, but it's meant to be a ruined castle that is made out of sandstone, so a rough texture will work really well for this setup. In this model instead we're going to use some hard modelling clay to cover all of the seam lines and smooth out any transitions or pieces that are a little bit rough. Just using your finger will work well for most parts here, but if you've got any sculpting tools on hand, that will help you speed up the process, and you can use a craft knife for cutting away any unneeded bits of clay to leave a nice flat surface behind. Now what we did right here was a big mistake, and you'll see why later on in the video. We decided to mix some aquarium gravel with silicone and set it in place to mimic rubble, which looks alright on this model. But when we actually came to uncast it, it caused us no end of grief when it came to taking the mould of the model out later on. Next up comes the casting process, which starts off with us building a wall around the model out of foam board. This is to try and catch any of the silicone from the first few coats that will pool around the base of the model. Using a hot glue gun, stick your model down to whatever surface you're going to be working on to make sure that it won't move around or float up during the dense silicone casting process. Next, use the hot glue gun to stick the foam board down around the model. You want to make sure that you leave enough room around the edges for the mould to be strong. 1 to 2 centimeters should be enough. Now, to reduce the amount of silicone you need, you want to follow the contours of the model as closely as possible. You can do this by scoring one side of the foam board and then breaking it along that line. The other side of the cut will still be solid, and you'll be left with a flexible seam that means you can contour the foam board however you like. By doing this around the whole model, you reduce down the amount of silicone you needed while still making the mould strong. You should also take care to cover any of the seams between the pieces of foam and your work surface with more hot glue to make sure that there are no gaps for the silicone to leak out of. Once that is all finished, you can mix up some silicone. Make sure to follow the precise instructions for your silicone when mixing the parts together, as each type of silicone will generally have a different mix ratio. Some will be 1 part A to 1 part B, while others might be a ratio of 1 to 100. So you need to check, otherwise you might end up with silicone that doesn't cure properly. Here you can see what happens if you get your mix ratio wrong with your silicone. We accidentally used too much of the catalyst, which causes the silicone to harden. We went straight from mixing it to pouring it, and you can see that it starts to thicken up very quickly to the point where it's physically hanging from the edge of the mixing stick. One last coat of the thin silicone to cover everything around the base of the ruin and try to preserve some of the main details of the walls, and then we're ready to remove the foam board around the model. Once the foam board's been pulled away, we add some thickening agent to our silicone mix so that we can brush it onto the outside of the ruin. This is different to just adding more of the catalyst, as it doesn't speed up the curing time but gives you a nice thick mixture, and that will basically cling to the surface really well and allow for a really good casting. You want to make sure that you're covering as much of the area as possible with this thick mix, and that you are making it thick enough that the whole mould won't break apart when removing the model. You also need to make sure that you leave enough time for the silicone to cure between each of the thick coats, otherwise the weight of it will just drag it down at the bottom of your model and you just have wasted silicone. After you've applied enough coats of the silicone and left the mould to cure, then you can go about making a mother mould out of plaster of Paris. Now the purpose of the mother mould is to add some extra rigidity to the silicone underneath when you are casting in order to keep the desired shape, so you can reinforce this as much or as little of the model as you want. What you need to do is to just make sure that you keep enough plaster away from the mould without having to damage the model inside. For this mould we chose to just reinforce the tall sections of the walls by wrapping them in strips of plaster bandages. Once the plaster is set, it's time to remove it from the outside of the mould and to take the print out of the inside. You will see that we have written O's on the outside of the plaster and I's on the inside of the plaster to make it easier to put them back on when needed. When removing the print from the mould, you can be a little rough with it as you don't need to keep the print in pristine condition. Here we break away the floor sections and dig out the wall pieces of the print to be left with our finished mould. This is the point where we notice the mistake. One thing to remember about silicone is it doesn't really like to bond to anything else except for silicone. The problem is that we coated all of the gravel in silicone earlier on, which made it stick really strongly. This was a massive pain as we had to go back and try and dig out as much of the gravel on the silicone as possible by hand without causing any damage to any other parts of the mould. In this case, PVA glue would probably have been a much better idea for adhering the gravel to the mould. Finally, after spending too long pulling out bits of gravel, it's time to cast the model. Now there are still a few little bits of the print still in the depths of the mould here, as we are simply unable to get them out. However, the first casting should seep down to all of those pieces and pull them out of the mould when we cast the resin. When mixing your resin, follow the same rules as with your silicone. Make sure to get your mix ratio right. Now you might need multiple cups, and that's fine. Just keep making sure that your mix is consistent until you've filled your mould. Now you just have to wait for your resin to cure. Again, this should be written somewhere on your resin's packaging or attached documentation. Simply peel the silicone away from the newly cast model within the mould. For this first cast, we did not use any mould release spray, as we wanted to pull out the leftover bits of the print so it didn't come away easily, and it would have come away so much easier if we'd sprayed some mould release, but some extra hands never hurt. You can see that the resin even managed to pull out a few of the leftover bits of gravel that we'd missed from within the mould, as well as a fairly large piece on the top corner of one of the columns. This will mean that any cast from now on will get into every part of the mould as desired, and the mould release spray will make it come out a whole lot easier. After casting comes painting. For the base, we gave it a once over with some orange spray paint, and then we gave it a wash all over with some brown wash like you can see in our Dragon Skull video. The only difference being that we didn't wash any of it away this time, as we wanted to make it look, well, like a ruin, so grungy and dirty basically. On top of the orange and wash base, we chose to dry brush a mix of white, orange, brown and yellow paint together to get our desired colour. This was rarely to make the details of the model pop. Now for dry brushing, you want to try and get as much of the paint off your brush as possible before you start painting the model, as you only want it to stick on the pronounced edges of the model. One coat of dry brushing is all that's needed for the ruin, and then you're done. Give it a coat of some clear food safe spray lacquer and your own red keep will be finished. Thank you so much for watching the video, and if you haven't had the chance to, check out our other videos in the Game of Thrones Vivarium series, as they're definitely worth the watch. Please like and subscribe if you want to see more projects like this in the future. Thanks again, and see you in the next video.